This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, 20, Tranquility, we copy.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another session of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we'll be continuing our lecture about how the Nazis popularized their dictatorship. In particular, we're going to talk about things like the massive Strength Through Joy program, also known as Kraft, durch, Freude. And we'll also talk about some of the other efforts, the other sort of social welfare programs that the Nazis put together that are designed to improve the lives of ordinary German citizens. Now, this is the second half of a lecture that I've already recorded. So if you follow the podcast regularly, you know at the beginning of these episodes, I like to kind of lay out the interpretive argument. I like to kind of put things into context. And so because I already did that for this lecture in the previous episode, I'm actually not going to go into a lot of detail about that here. The short argument, if you need a refresher or if you haven't listened to the previous episode, is that one of the things the Nazis try to do is to make ordinary people feel like their lives are getting better. And they do this not by just trying to say, oh, the economy is better, oh, people have jobs. They do this not just in the type of, especially Anglo-American sense of, let's have consumerism, let's try to shower you with material wealth and you can buy a bunch of stuff. But the way that the Nazis try to sell this idea to the general public is the idea that they are giving people access to the quote-unquote good life. That everyone in German society is part of this biological, national, racial community called the Volksgemeinschaft. And the responsibility within the Volksgemeinschaft is not just for people to listen to the Führer, but it is also for the national community to look out for the welfare of all the citizens. The idea of what the nation and the national community are supposed to be about is not just bonds of responsibility, but it's also going to give access to the good life to those people that are kind of at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And so when you put all these things together, what the Nazis essentially do is they sell the virtue of dictatorship based on this idea that your life is getting better, that even as you're having these kind of political rights, these legal rights stripped away from you, you're actually getting more kind of immediate personal freedom. We talked in the previous episode a lot about cars and the freedom that you get from owning a car because it allows you to do lots of different things that previously you couldn't do. So again, at the same time that the Nazis are taking away your political rights, they argue that they are giving you these kind of more cultural, these more social freedoms, and that on the whole, people are going to respond to having more kind of personal freedoms. My ability to go and do the things I want in life, to enjoy the good life, to go to the beach, to go on a cruise, to go to the movies. For some people, that's more important and more immediate than the abstract ideal of voting. So again, that's kind of a condensed version of the sort of intro, the main argument. If you want to hear more about that, again, go back and listen to that initial first half of the episode where I go into more detail about the Volksgemeinschaft, talk a lot about Volkswagen, the car company, and sort of its origins in Nazi ideology. Anyway, with that said, let's get back to the history. Now, perhaps the best example of this approach to social welfare was Kraft, durch, Freude, or strength through joy, which was a program introduced by the Nazis through the German Workers' Front, or the DAF, in November 1933. Basically, this program was launched by DAF leader Robert Ley with the intention of reharmonizing the relationship between work and leisure. Now, most of you probably approach this question in a modern way, which is to say that if or when you think about the relationship between work and leisure, you think about them as opposites. Work is what we do to make ends meet. It's the have-to part of life that we'd all abandon if we won the big lottery. Leisure, on the other hand, is the time when we get to do the things in life that we actually want to do. How many of you out there really are thinking, well, it's Saturday, I know the office is closed, but I really wish I could go into the office because I just love to do some more number crunching. I'd love to prepare another presentation. You work in a factory and you say, man, I know my shift is over, but I really just wish I could do 2 or 3 more hours on the assembly line because building cars is just so much fun. Right? That's the work aspect of it. We do our work stuff that we have to do. Leisure is the time when we get to do the things that we want to do. This is a time or place when we are usually physically separated from our work, when we rest and recover, and hopefully we get to do some things that we actually want to do in life if we can. Now, it's worth pointing out that this distinction wasn't always the case. Some people, even though I just kind of made fun of the idea, some people out there find their work pretty enjoyable. There are also professions where you are always on call, or like me, there's always some kind of thing that you can be working on. Right now, it's the summer. I'm not teaching classes as a university professor, but I still have lots of things to do. I still have committees I serve on, reports to fill out, research to do, writing to do. I'm doing this podcast. Sometimes I have summer interns. There's always lots of stuff that one can be doing in certain professions. Maybe you're a doctor. Maybe you're always on call, even if you've gone home for the night. Now, historically, this division between workspace and kind of leisure space was less pronounced. Many people in the 19th century, for example, live in shops or workshops where they just kind of live above in the building. Or if you're a factory worker, you probably live pretty close to your factory. But what we can say here is that by the start of the 20th century, the distinction between these two opposites, between work and leisure, began to be increasingly pronounced. Industrialization, rationalization, mechanization, all of these things kind of degrade the status and the experience of work so that you look at what you're doing less as what one might call an art form, right? I'm a cobbler and I'm making a shoe. I have some personal investment in how the shoe turns out. And this becomes more of a, I'm just going through the motions. I'm on the hamster wheel. I'm part of the rat race. In short, work begins to suck. It seems monotonous. It seems soulless. And it seems, above all else, perhaps boring. If you've ever seen the movie Office Space, which is one of the great sort of representations of this phenomenon that I'm talking about. The movie is about this young office worker, and he gets hypnotized, and the therapist dies as he's like hypnotized him and said, just do whatever you want. And he comes to realize that he hates working in an office, right? And so it's about this kind of tension. One of the jokes in it is about writing TPS reports and how monotonous and pointless and mind-numbing it is. So that in particular, but the movie Office Space as a whole, it illustrates in many ways this kind of hostile or antithetical relationship I'm talking about here between the idea of work and leisure. Now, in most countries, society's big answer to this dilemma or this frustration has been to more closely regulate the amount of time that workers spend working. We have had, thank goodness, the introduction of things like the weekend or the 8-hour day. Less time at the office or the factory, in many ways, is meant to mean more time doing other things. And it's not that I derive, or theoretically one derives, more happiness from being on the job. It is that because you're not in that job space as much, you can take time off to do other things that will provide happiness in your life. Now, in the United States and in the United Kingdom, this is channeled in many ways into the idea of consumption or consumerism. This is the sort of theory that buying or acquiring new things or gaining a certain level of material prosperity, if you want to put it in those terms, that this is the path to happiness. Spend less time working, spend more time out in the yard. Dad, you're grilling. Mom, you're sunning by the pool. Kids are playing. This is the path towards happiness that is especially sold to people in the 1940s and 50s here in the United States. To the Nazis, however, to people like Robert Ley, this approach based on consumption is too materialistic. Again, he thinks of it as being soulless, as being focused on just this idea of getting stuff, of buying stuff, of consuming stuff. He would argue that actually there's too little attention being paid here to what workers are doing after their shifts are over. It's not enough just to release you into the world and say, okay, go buy some stuff, go consume some stuff, go see a movie. From a psychological standpoint, the Nazis would argue that especially this idea of consumption is an unhealthy approach to the idea of happiness. To Ley and many members of the DAF, the answer instead is not to divorce work from leisure, but to reconnect the two, to make the latter contribute to the success of the former. Or again, as Shelley Baranowski has artfully put it, quote, organized recreation would cultivate character while relaxing body and soul. And as a result, workers would derive satisfaction from their work, abandon their inferiority complexes, and become more productive, end quote. What this meant in practice was that the creation of a number of social or cultural programs like the aforementioned Volkswagen scheme, which were meant to bring the good life to the masses. Now, I want you to stop for a moment and think for a second about what does that phrase, the good life, mean to you? What would you do if you had enough money or resources? What would you do if you didn't need to think about finances? What if you won the lottery and had some extra money to spend? One of the questions, of course, is, well, how much money did I win? Right? If the lottery ticket is small, you might go to some form of local public entertainment. You might go to a concert, a movie, maybe a show at a cultural center. Maybe you take your spouse out to dinner or your kids. These types of events aren't necessarily life-changing, but they can be enjoyable, and they fit within an otherwise busy schedule. I don't need to retire in order to be able to go see a movie. So it's not surprising if we think about these kind of small qualitative things that we enjoy, that the KDF program puts significant resources into staging these types of small events, or in trying to find ways to make them more accessible to, again, working class and especially rural Germans. Sometimes this meant staging the event as a whole. The KDF, for example, created a 90-person orchestra that essentially just went around touring Germany. And it not only gave concerts for, again, working class Germans, but it went out into the rural areas. It brought sophisticated musical performances for free to people who otherwise previously could not have attended them. If you think about modern concerts today, most, although not all, of the big name artists that go around, they're only in cities. And so how is it that people from rural areas get to go hear major singers, major performances? They have to drive there, right? They've got that car that we talked about giving them freedom at the beginning of the episode. There are, however, some artists that will go out into rural areas to try to give people there a chance to hear their music. And that obviously makes them very happy. This 90-person orchestra that's going to tour around Germany and some of the smaller KDF programs, that is the sense you get, right? You live in a little town, a little village, and all of a sudden you're going to get to hear a live concert by professionally acclaimed musicians. That's pretty cool. In other areas, the KDF doesn't directly produce the thing that's going to be consumed, but they leverage their massive scale in order to purchase large numbers of seats at discounts, and then they offer them to factory workers directly. KDF shows up and says, I want to buy half your seats. And you say, okay, yeah, that's a lot. Of course, I'm going to offer that at some kind of discount. And then they take those tickets and they give them to the local factory representative that is a member of the DAF. And that guy says, hey, okay, these people have been good Nazis. These people have been loyal party members. I'm going to hook them up. I'm going to give them these tickets. Sometimes it's not even party members, right? Sometimes you just say, hey, I know you haven't been to anything. You might want to go hear some Richard Wagner being played. Here's a ticket to the theater. Here's a ticket to the movie. Just to give you some numbers here, to give you a sense of the size of the program that I'm talking about, by 1934, which is when Germany is still in the Great Depression, it's starting to emerge from it. Things are looking better, but there are still a ton of unemployed people. The Kraft, durch, Freude program offers just over 1,000 concerts, and these are attended by over 500,000 Germans. By 1938, this total had increased by a factor of 5, with over 5,000 concerts staged and 2.5 million attendees. The DAF's theater production wing was even more popular. Again, looking at the numbers from this kind of first year in 1934, the KDF puts on over 2,800 performances, which were attended by some 1.5 million people. By 1938, it had risen to close to 20,000 performances with 7.4 million attendees. Now, note these are figures for the traditional theater. We're not talking here about operas, folk festivals, movies at the cinema, right? That's even more and more leisure on top of all these things. Now, another area in which the KDF makes a massive intervention was in the area of fitness and sports, which in today's affluential societies are incredibly popular pastimes. People living in the United States, people living in Europe in the 21st century are obsessed not just with health, but with sports, with working out at the gym, with having, very fit bodies. I just saw The Odyssey this week. Matt Damon is about my age. Matt Damon is incredibly fit and incredibly muscular for a 20-year-old, let alone someone who's about 50. So the Nazis are also into this idea of nature and health and wellness. They sponsor hiking and nature clubs. They also set up courses that are available, again, to ordinary working-class Germans that teach skills in sports like tennis, or that take them on skiing trips, or help them learn how to sail. In its first year, for example, the KDF offers over 8,500 such courses, and eventually it'll rise to almost 50,000 courses per year. Now, this is just for learning things like sports, again, tennis, skiing, sailing. Another kind of sport that Germans have long been obsessed with is gymnastics. In 1935, the KDF offers over 190,000 gymnastics programs. They want to get these working class Germans out there in nature, working out, playing games, running, jumping, frolicking, but in essence being healthy and being connected to nature as opposed to consuming things. By just their third summer, over 3 million Germans will have participated in a KDF sports program. Now, in some ways, these efforts are less novel, perhaps, in terms of the experience then it was a reflection of the totalitarian takeover of society. The Nazis do not invent the idea of the soccer club. They do not invent the idea of the working class cycling association. If you go back to the middle of the 19th century, when the kind of labor movement was heavily repressed, both the Communist Party, or what became the Communist Party, and especially the Social Democratic Party, had built these kind of strong, worker-oriented cultural associations that were robust, that were a key part of working class life. Now, by banning the political parties and the labor unions, the Nazis essentially erased their kind of cultural counterparts. And so there's a kind of natural cohesion here, or a natural flow, where the Nazis don't want to piss everybody off by getting rid of your choral association. So they just Nazify it during this period of Gleichschaltung, or coordination, that we talked about in a previous podcast episode. In other words, with some of the stuff I've talked about so far, the KDF is not necessarily reinventing the wheel so much as taking over and colonizing parts of the wheel, or wheels that existed before them. That said, there is still a dynamic kind of element here to what the Nazis are doing. Think for a moment about who goes sailing, or who's going on a skiing trip. Or in today's modern world, who goes and plays golf all the time? Are kids from, let's say, the inner city, are kids from Appalachia, especially some of the poorer rural areas, are they going on skiing trips? Are they going sailing all the time? Are they members of what we might call the country club? The answer, of course, is probably not. Right? There may be some examples where they are, especially Appalachia. You have mountains there, obviously. But for the most part, some of these sports that I talked about, especially skiing, sailing, and tennis, these are elite sports. This is stuff that Louis XIV was doing. He literally, if you listen to the episode on the French Revolution, we have a part of the episode where we talk about the tennis court oath. Why is it called the tennis court oath? Because Louis played a lot of tennis. Because he was a wealthy guy, and that's what you did if you had a lot of money. Peasants are not playing tennis in revolutionary France. So these are elite sports. They're open to the type of people that would describe themselves as elites. They're not open to the general public. And so part of the genius of what the Nazis are doing is they are, again, taking elements of that elite lifestyle and saying, now you also get to go skiing. Now you also get to play tennis. They were, again, to reinforce the theme of today's lecture, a way of making people feel empowered, a way of making people feel like, hey, my life is getting better because I now have access to these things that I never had access to before. Now, perhaps one of the most important ways in which the KDF impresses many Germans or convinces them that their lives are getting better is not just through the kind of daily life practices like sports, but more on that kind of escapism that has become so key to the modern world. And by this, I mean travel. In particular, I love travel. I'm a huge traveler. But this is something that a lot of people think about in terms of leisure. What are you doing this summer? I am going to travel somewhere. Why do gas prices go up in the summer traditionally? A big part of it is because kids are off of school, summer vacation. We're not going to hang out at the house all the time. Of course, we're going to go somewhere. And so another KDF program focuses on tourism and offers working class Germans subsidized experiences like vacations and cruises. In fact, by 1936, the KDF had become the single largest promoter of tourism in Germany, booking something like more than 11% of all overnight stays. Between 1934 and 1939, over 34 million Germans take one of these trips. Now, in some cases, these trips are kind of subsidized vacations. They're again, acquired using economies of scale, right? Again, we're going to book up your whole chalet, so give us a discount, and we'll pass that on to the workers. But again, there is a sense of creativity, of dynamism with which the Nazis approach these ideas. It's not just going through the motions, or again, kind of saying, well, we'll just kind of do basic things. We don't want to rock the boat too much. The Nazis engage in some of these ambitious schemes that even when they don't work out, still afford them a degree of confidence, a degree of credit from the general public. Now, perhaps one of the most outstanding KDF programs, for example, was the construction of a massive resort complex of Prora on the Baltic island of Rügen. Now, many Germans had loved the idea before this of being out in sand, in water, in sunshine. Germans have a deep connection, stereotypically, to nature. Going back to the sort of onset of the building of the railroads, this had enabled working class Germans to do things like, hey, I want to go to the lake, I want to go for a swim, I want to hang out on the beach. If you've ever been to Germany, they don't even need a beach, they'll just go to a public park. You'll see people that kind of strip down, sometimes completely, and they just lay around in the sun for a little while. But in the late 19th, early 20th century, the idea of the beach vacation was not something that was as accessible to people as it is today. The large resorts in places like Coney Island, Atlantic City, Brighton, if you're in England, the Norman coast in France, most of these spaces, maybe not Coney Island, but most of the spaces, at least initially, were designed for more elite or at least middle-class visitors. We're going to build a kind of complex here, and it's going to be for the wealthy to escape the heat, and they're going to hang out, they're going to socialize, and they're going to enjoy amusements. But it's not something that most working class people are able to do. The Nazis, however, will try to accelerate what we might call the democratization of going to the beach. In May 1936, they begin building this 20,000-person resort at Prora, complete with modern amenities such as indoor plumbing and central heating. Each room was supposed to overlook the sea, with wave pools, a movie theater, and a festival hall, completing the total entertainment experience. Working class Germans, when the program was completed or when the building was completed, would theoretically be able to book a week's stay here for just 20 Reichsmark, which in 1936 is the equivalent of about $8, which translated today would be about $200. Would you like to go to a sandals resort for a week in the Caribbean for $200? Yes, you would still have to pay for the airfare there, but yes, for $200, yes, I would like a nice luxury beach vacation. That's one heck of a deal. Now, why are the Nazis doing this? Again, it goes back to some of those themes that we've talked about, but especially this idea of bringing the good life to the masses. Now, just as we saw with the Volkswagen plan, the Prora resort is never actually completed. They build kind of the outer shells of most of the buildings, but by the time war breaks out in 1939, they can't afford to waste any extra resources on building beach vacation sites, right? We've got to get ready for war. We've got to build tanks and guns and factories and things like that. So they never actually completed the resort at Prora. You can actually visit the site today. There are tours that are offered of it. It is a place that was kind of largely abandoned after 1939. I've never been there, but again, you can go and visit today if you really want to. Finally, if you're talking about the ultimate elite vacation experience, if you won that lottery and you quit your job and you had some time off, what's the first thing that you're going to do? Can anybody beat going on a cruise? Cruises, even today, are in many ways still the epitome of luxury, or at least temporary luxury that middle and working class people can get access to, a place where you're waited on hand and foot, where you can go to spas, where you're treated to spectacular shows and incredible scenery, and everyone treats you like you're sort of special, right? The waiters, the staff, all the people working on the cruise ship, they are so excited about you being there, and they're just there to serve you. I don't know about most of you, but that doesn't happen in other locations, in other experiences in my life. So going on the cruise ship is, even in a temporary way, a kind of elite experience. Now, before the 1930s, this sense of luxury was even more pronounced because steamers were often divided into separate classes of passenger, and depending on what class you're in, you get different perks and different experiences and even access to different parts of the ship. You think about the experience of cruising today as being a kind of democratized luxury. The experience of flying on an airplane is the exact opposite. These airlines, it seems, create more and more sort of strategies, levels, statuses, and they've been very successful at becoming increasingly profitable by kind of isolating and sort of ostracizing people in some ways, right? If you want to go on an airplane today and you just want the basic economy fare, you're going to sit in the back. You're probably not going to get any food. You probably won't even get a window seat, maybe not even an aisle seat. And you're going to be the last one on. You're going to pay for your baggage. They're almost getting to the point where, if you've ever seen the movie Titanic, it feels like you're in steerage, like you're third class, and they're just going to kind of lock you down there and, don't come up to see the light of day until we arrive. So again, to bring this all back to the topic today, the KDF wants to bring the luxury experiences of cruising to working class Germans. To do so, they basically buy or rent 12 different cruise ships. They will even build two 25,000-ton ships specifically to be KDF ships. And these ships will take working and middle-class Germans on trips to places like Italy, places like the Scandinavian fjords. And most importantly, it will allow them to experience a new level of luxury and leisure and make them feel like, hey, under democracy, there was fights in the street every day. I was struggling to survive. I was taking unemployment insurance, or I hope my store would just barely stay open. And now I am living the good life. I am going on a cruise. I am being waited on. I am being treated like I am a pretty special person. In fact, to realize these Nazi ideological goals of the Volksgemeinschaft, the KDF ships, unlike, again, modern airplane travel especially, it only features a single class. The Nazis performatively erase the distinctions that they so condemned in Weimar's democracy, that so bothered people in Weimar's democracy. If you're running for political office today and you want to just kind of win support from a whole bunch of different people, here's a great idea. Go pass a law that says airlines are not allowed to have more than two classes of service. Go pass a law saying they got to bring the peanuts and the free baggage back. Now, the airlines are going to hate that, and maybe that cuts into their long-term profitability, but I guarantee a whole lot of people who fly airlines are going to say, thank goodness it's back to the way it used to be. This is essentially what the Nazis do with the cruise ships. They take this experience that is an elite experience that is only reserved for the wealthy, and they begin to make ordinary Germans feel like, hey, you can do it too. Even better from the Nazi perspective, the idea of going on a cruise ship also fits with a lot of their ideas of racial hygiene. It's going to give you exposure to sun and wind and nature. They're going to stack these ships with onboard gyms, with swimming pools, with theater for cultural events. And in one kind of big change from the modern cruise ship experience, they are not going to emphasize either gambling or alcohol. These KDF voyages are kind of the opposite of the booze cruise, right? You're not going there to party. You're going there for mental and in some ways physical wellness. Between 1934 and 1939, about 700,000 Germans go on one of these KDF cruises. Now, the proportion of working class Germans that are counted in these figures is probably smaller than what someone like Robert Ley would have hoped for. If you want to go on a cruise, you still have to be able to take time off from work. And one of the other kind of things going on in the Nazi economy is that workers are actually working longer hours because there's this drive for rearmament, for preparation for war. But again, sometimes it's not a question of did you get to do it yourself? It's the idea that these types of opportunities exist that matters most. There is a powerful, powerful sense that people have of even if I can't do it, as long as I can imagine myself doing it, then it still counts for something. There's a really great KDF propaganda poster that you can find if you Google online, and it shows a couple and they're on the KDF cruise, and the slogan below it says, "Now you too can travel." And this phrase, I think, perfectly sums up the idea of empowerment that I've been talking about in today's lecture. You, before the Nazis, this was an opportunity that was not available to you. It was only for the elites. But now, you too can have a taste of the good life. So far, I've illustrated a number of Nazi social welfare programs that are designed, again, to make people feel better, to give them access to the good life. And a lot of it is about doing things that are different from what you did before, that are about kind of focusing more on that leisure side of the equation than on the work side of the equation that Ley talked about. Not everything, however, was about travel. While the KDF focused on mollifying workers by, again, giving them access to this idea of the good life, it also sought to transform the factory floor from a site of labor conflict to a place where the Volksgemeinschaft was practiced on a daily basis. Central to this idea became an initiative known as the beauty of labor. Now, the beauty of labor said it's not about, again, the leisure side of things. We want to focus on how can we improve the workplace in order to make the experience of work feel better. So think about your own lives, especially if you work in an office, if you work in a factory. What are some things that could be done or have been done to improve the quality of your life and the experience of being at an office? For the Nazis, the idea of improving the workspace was not only based on, again, the idea of how long people were there, or perhaps even worker safety, but they really leaned in on the idea of aesthetics. Beauty of labor meant making the workplace itself a happy, enriching place. One of the ways that they did this was by trying to introduce better air and lighting into the factory floors or into the offices. Germans are also stereotypically obsessed with the idea of order and cleanliness. And so one of the initiatives, one of the ways that beauty of labor is realized, is to go in and clean up the shop floors. Is to say, okay, we also want you to have a connection to nature. You're in a factory, so obviously that's going to be pretty limited. But why not put a garden next to the factory? Why not create green spaces so that people can begin to feel a little human again? I live in Greenville, South Carolina, and one of the really clever things that the people who designed the airport did is they created a little garden with fountains and a little bit of greenery, some trees. So as you're waiting for your flight, instead of just being stuck in this kind of, big hangar type area, this big kind of like soulless airport, instead of just buying stuff or watching your phone, why don't you just go out and be in nature a little bit? Get just a little bit of peace of mind before you go on the airplane. It's a brilliant idea, and obviously it's not taken directly from the Nazis, but the Nazis do things like that. right? They're trying to introduce more nature, more green spaces into the factory floors. They will invest resources in things like a modern washroom, including showers. In some cases, the beauty of labor programs, you can see pictures of this online. It's one of the funniest images from Nazi Germany, which is not really a phrase that we use very often. But one of the things you can find are these workers at the factory, and they're like in swim trunks with goggles on because they're getting tan. Essentially, the Nazis had a program that you could put sun lamps in your factory so that your workers, even if they're inside all the time, even if they're dealing with difficult conditions, guess what? We'll let them have a little bit of natural beauty or artificial light in order to make them feel better about themselves, in order to kind of, again, contribute to what they would call, or what we would call today, wellness. The Nazis get dinged for obvious and legitimate reasons for their approach to gender. But one of the things that the beauty of labor folks do is they come in and they start saying, we actually are starting to have more women in the workplace here. Why don't we build an on-site daycare to help them out? Why don't we start building and financing canteens so that the workers are getting at least one decent meal a day? We can make sure it's nutritious, it's hearty, whatever. By 1935, over 17,000 German businesses had participated in the Beauty of Labor program. By 1939, it had supposedly led to the creation of 13,000 green spaces, 15,000 canteens, and over 20,000 washrooms. Now, while a big part of the realization of the Volksgemeinschaft was about this idea of accessing the good life, of getting to enjoy things that maybe previously just the elites could do, the Nazis did not ignore the fact that their seizure of power had taken place against the backdrop of the Great Depression, that many Germans were still dealing with the challenge of meeting their basic needs for food and shelter. So in addition to creating beach resorts and marketing popular automobiles, they also introduced a host of social welfare programs designed to again affirm and reflect the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft. Perhaps the most important of these social welfare programs was the Winterhilfswerk, or the Winter Aid Program, which was officially established on September 13, 1933. The Winter Aid Program was initially designed to coordinate and consolidate a variety of emergency relief programs that had been developed over the past 4 years to mitigate the worst effects of the Great Depression. The first winter of Nazi rule, the Winter Aid Program, for example, employed about 4,000 people, while mobilizing 1.5 million volunteers, all in the name of helping needy Germans. They did so by engaging in things like clothing drives. They set up and ran soup kitchens. They collected breast milk from mothers who could no longer nurse. This is before the invention of baby formula. So if you're a young mother, maybe even a single mother, and you have a child, and you're living in this kind of very difficult existence during the Great Depression, you're only getting fed through soup kitchens, it might be hard to make breast milk for your baby. This is something that really matters to you. It's much deeper than this question of, well, did you get to vote or not? The Nazis set up charitable organizations to be able to get milk to that baby, right? This would probably be milk from a mother whose child had just been weaned. Maybe this would be milk from a mother who had extra milk. But basically, if you think about it, this is such a fundamental and such a meaningful act of charity that the Nazis are helping to organize for those particular women who were in a difficult position. Now, some of these things, like the soup kitchen that I just mentioned, are a continuation of Weimar-era programs. Some of them are not necessarily new. Some of them are similar to kind of government-driven social welfare that we experience today in many countries. Again, just as we saw with the labor movement and the ways in which they designed these leisure programs or took over programs that already existed, from the labor movement, the Nazis also put their own sort of populist spin on these very basic social welfare programs. It's not just about giving handouts to the poor. Oh, these are the unfortunate. Oh, you're doing well, or you've made some money. Give some of it up for someone else. It's not that idea of what we might call Christian charity today. But instead, this is sold as an opportunity to mobilize civil society in the name of the national good. For example, the Nazis don't just simply pass a law and said, okay, we're going to have this organization. There's going to be a program. It's going to, use government resources. I mentioned food stamps earlier, right? This is kind of what food stamps is in the United States. There's people who don't have enough money to afford food, or we could help them to get above the poverty line by giving them some food, maybe some better quality food. Let's create an agency. Let's create a bureaucracy, and then we'll go from there. Instead, basically what Hitler and the Nazis do is they make a campaign. They begin to try to mobilize civil society in its own right, not because they're legally forced to, or even kind of invisibly or somewhat invisibly through like taxation, but they're going to make a big public campaign that people need to contribute to the social welfare of the folk. Hitler and other top Nazis are going to go around Germany giving speeches, especially come the late fall, saying, hey guys, it's time to chip in to the winter aid program because we need to take care of our fellow Germans. The Nazi Party itself is going to make large public donations, which, oh, by the way, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry can then widely publicize. What is the Nazi Party? You're not seeing newsreels about people getting arrested in concentration camps and the SA, destroying things. You're seeing images of here's the Nazi Party giving large sums of money, whether it's nationally or locally, to the local community to help the local community. Just as we saw with the employment campaigns, these Nazi funding drives, they're not just, again, I'm going to give a speech and walk away from it, but at the lower levels of the party, at the sort of ground troops or the shock troops, if you will, especially among the SA, these guys are going to get out there on the street and they are going to use a system of pressure and reward to get buy-in from the community as a whole. If you are someone who is going to give to the fund, guess what? It's not just going to be a tax write-off, which is between you and the IRS and maybe your spouse. That's going to be something publicly recognized. Party leaders, when they give a speech, when they open the little local festival, they're going to say, and by the way, Robert over here was a great contributor to the winter aid program. Thank you, Robert, for all that you did. In fact, if you set up a regular donation or subscription to the winter aid program, the Nazis will give you a little shingle, and you put that shingle on your door, and then everybody that walks by goes, oh, we see Robert, he's really dedicated to this idea of charity. He's a really good person. He's giving money to the community to help it survive, to help the less fortunate. That's really generous of you, Robert. In fact, this has a kind of double meaning because not only does Robert get an attaboy, a pat on the back, but also when the local SA guys decide, okay, it's time for a winter aid campaign, I'm going to knock on your door. I'm going to say, Herr Hansen, have you given money to the winter aid campaign this year? Wink, wink, right? It's kind of a, have you given money? But also it's not a, would you like to give money? It's, have you given money? Because if you don't give money, then the stormtrooper knows that you're not really on board the team, and maybe you're someone that needs to have a good talking to. Maybe some guys need to show up. Maybe they need to give you some signs of how you're standing outside the community. You really need to get on side here. You need to pitch in. There's also just the fact that many of us don't like being pestered by sales calls, people asking you for money. So if I put the shingle up, then I get left alone. Hey, okay, good. I like that idea. I will contribute just for the value of being left alone, perhaps. So there is this kind of carrot and stick system that gets set up, at the local level, where, yes, the people that are enforcing it are from the party, so in a way it's the government, but it's also your neighbor. It's also people in your community that are doing the enforcement. And if you don't go along with supporting this initiative, as I said, there might be some kind of consequence. Maybe it's social exclusion. Maybe it's harassment. In rare instances, people actually can be fired or arrested because it's like, hey, you're not on the team. You're not pitching in. Why should we like you? By the end of the first Nazi winter in early 1934, the winter aid program had raised over 350 million Reichsmark, a massive success for the party, and of course as well for its propaganda arm. Now, to make the program even more effective, a November 1934 law allowed the government to suspend any charities that directly competed with the winter aid program. From its emergency start, it soon became a permanent feature of Nazi government. Now, how does this take us back to popularity for the regime? SA men showing up, kind of threatening me, making me contribute to their charity program. This doesn't sound like a program for success. If you're out there, you're going to campaign for office in the United States today, I don't know that this would be my, go-to recommendation. But as I said, this scheme was genius for two reasons. First, as the historian Richard Evans has noted, part of what it did was it added this kind of propaganda value for the regime. Not just in the sense of, oh, Hitler and the Nazis are looking out for the less fortunate, but there's a more kind of fundamental approach that's going on here. In the Weimar era, or even if you think about modern social welfare programs, it is easy to kind of criticize these as being government handouts. What is something like disability insurance or Medicaid? It is the government collecting taxes from people who have jobs and giving it to poor people who may or may not have a job, but it's basically kind of transferring wealth from one person to the other. This is often criticized again as the government sort of taking from one group and giving it to the other. In the Nazi example, because they kind of push people to buy in at the grassroots level, one could argue that it is, or it can be portrayed as, an example of the nation helping itself. It is a true sign of the national community coming together for the assistance of the less fortunate. It is less like the boogeyman of socialism, and isn't socialism redistributing wealth and, it's terrible, and, if you're a libertarian, you'd say, get rid of that stuff. Let people sink or swim on their own. The closer analogy to what the Nazis are doing is more like the American Red Cross or the Red Crescent or, the various, depending on the country, and the red, whatever. It is an idea of the community coming together to help the less fortunate. When hurricanes hit New Orleans, or we had a hurricane here 2 years ago, it was very devastating, especially up in Asheville area in North Carolina. People said, give money to the Red Cross. The Red Cross is going to help with rebuilding. It's going to get emergency aid up there. It's going to pay for doctors and medical care. Nobody criticized that. Nobody said, oh, the Red Cross, this is government, you're taking from us. And people celebrated the idea of community coming together. And even though the Nazi winter aid program, the Nazi party is the government, and so it is kind of the government, there is, it's not voluntary, there is this kind of way that it can be sold as voluntary, sold as the practice of the Volksgemeinschaft. That's just one aspect of the program that is incredibly beneficial, politically speaking. The other thing it does, and this is again similar to what we saw with the employment drives, is that by having people display their participation in the program, you create this sense that everybody in society is buying into it, everybody's participating in it, everybody supports it. And because it is a Nazi party program, by extension, it looks like you support the Nazi Party. All the little shingles that are going up don't just say, oh, winter aid program, helping poor people, great. They have swastikas on them. They have signs and symbols of the Nazi Party. And so what you are doing is creating an illusion of popular will. It doesn't matter what the actual number of people who support the Nazis are or who don't support the Nazis. When you go out in the morning and you take your dog for a walk and you see everybody on the block has a little Nazi symbol on their doorpost, you start to say, even though I don't agree with the Nazis, even though I hate the Nazis, I'm pretty outnumbered here. The general consensus is that people like the Nazi Party. And so again, for individuals, giving to the winter aid can be kind of self-understood as an act of charity, but for the regime, it's a sign of support for dictatorship. Now, there were some other programs too, which I'll just briefly touch upon, that the Nazis set up that were, again, these kind of social welfare programs. With the destruction of the communist and then the social democratic parties in the first half of 1933, the Nazis were able to take over most of their charitable resources and functions. These were soon consolidated into a National Socialist People's Welfare Program, which gained 17 million members by the outbreak of World War II. It operated something like 8,000 nurseries for newborn babies, as well as a variety of other local targeted programs. Now, one of the things the Nazis also do is they create these new offices and, again, these new programs that are designed to educate the population, giving them important information that gives them a better sense of control over their lives. Think about for a second, in the modern world, and if you are a young person, if you're one of my students listening to this, if you get married and you have children one day, I guarantee that you will find yourself in this position where when you have children, they get all kinds of weird sort of rashes on their body. They get kind of weird noises that they make. There's just kind of odd things that happen. And you'll be like, well, I don't know what this means. Is this, I need to call a doctor in the middle of the night because this is life-threatening? Or is this just the baby had gas? This is just some random red, rash. It doesn't mean anything. It'll be gone tomorrow. Who cares? There is a dearth of information that you have about how to raise a kid, but you need it, right? And so the question is, where are you going to get that information? In today's world, of course, we have the internet. We have AI now. You could also call your parents, hopefully, if you're in touch with them, if they're still alive. Right, there are other resources in society that can help you with that. But we have lots of points of information to answer these types of questions. If you're sitting at home and you're thinking, you know what, I want to eat more healthy, I want to eat better, I want to lose some weight potentially, where do you get the information to figure out how to do that? Right? You can look at AI, the internet, maybe you buy a book, YouTube. We have, in many ways, too much information today. In 1933, however, we don't have all those sources of information. The only one that you really have is your community. If your mom's still around or if they're close by, you could call up mom. You could go over to her house and say, hey, what's going on with the baby? Maybe you're a member of a church. You could go talk to someone at the church. Maybe you could talk to someone at one of these auxiliary organizations. But for the most part, there is a demand for knowledge out there that is not satisfied by existing structures. And so one of the things that the Nazis do that is absolutely genius from a political standpoint is they create these programs and these offices like the Reichsmother Service that are going to offer things like courses on subjects like homemaking, interior design, infant care, child rearing. And these courses are going to answer some of those questions that people have. When you get pregnant for the first time, there are actually these like child birthing classes that you can take. And you go and it's like, okay, we're going to demystify this whole child rearing thing. And then you end up forgetting a lot of it because it's so much, and then you're not sleeping once your kids are born. But anyways, this is essentially what the Nazis are doing, right? They're creating programs to answer and demystify some of these challenges that people face in life. The Reich's Mother Service, by the way, just to give you an idea of its popularity, enrolls over 1.7 million women in its courses. There's another group called the German Women's Project that operates from 1933 to 1938. It will have around the same amount in terms of enrollment, but it will teach women about household skills and management. How do you budget your food? How do you cook? How do you can things? Have you ever tried to can goods before? I mean, not put them in a can and sell them. I mean, like making pickles or kimchi or, canning peaches so that you can eat them later because you don't have a refrigerator. I don't know how to can something. If I want to figure that out, I'll just Google it, right? Or I'll put it into AI or I'll watch a YouTube video. But again, they don't have these things back then. If you are a new bride, you're 19 years old, and your husband's 25, and he's working all the time because that's what, he's supposed to be doing, quote unquote. How do you gain the information you need to produce food for him, to make the food delicious? When you have the baby, your job is going to be to take care of the baby. How the heck do you know how to do that when you're 19? So for many working class Germans, the development of these programs is probably more important and impactful on their lives than the question of, did you get to vote? Right? How do I get my child either to survive or eventually to thrive? How do I make my husband happy? How do I run a household? These are critical, core, immediate questions that are going to impact my life right now. Did I get to vote? Do I have the right to free assembly? These are, to use a kind of modern expression, first world problems. So again, when you put all this together, you see all these ways in which the Nazi Party is interacting with the people that it's ruling over that are not predicated on the idea of repression and telling people what they can't do and taking away freedoms, but instead they found ways socially and perhaps culturally to give them access to new things, to give them information, to give them experiences that make their lives feel better, or in many ways that actually materially improve their lives. And this, I would argue, is a key part of how ordinary Germans experience Nazi dictatorship and why so many of them don't seem bothered at all by the loss of democracy. Right? Materially, my life is getting better, so therefore, who cares about the style of politics, the organization? I seem to be doing better now than I was before. Now, so far I've argued that programs like Strength Through Joy and the Winter Aid program were critical to creating popular support for the Nazi dictatorship. Some historians out there would counter that despite these impressive numbers, the actual participation rate, especially if we're talking about working class people, which we've done a lot of talking about working class people, they would argue that this is a little bit less than what the official statistics would indicate, that the Nazis talk a good game, and whether that was truly reflected in most people's lived realities is a different story. While certainly powerful, the KDF's entertainment and sports program, one could also argue, is basically a continuation of this pre-existing foundation that was laid by the labor movement, by working class organizations during the Kaiserreich. So how much credit do the Nazis really deserve for continuing something that was already going on? You could also argue that some of the more popular leisure programs, such as cruising, were still dominated by, quote unquote, the better classes. That if you're talking about workers that are especially at the lower end of being working class, I've got to work in the factory every day in order to make ends meet. I don't have time to go on a 2-week vacation to Norway. Finally, as we've seen, some of the KDF's greatest plans, the Prora Resort, the KDF-Wagen, these were never actually completed. You can dream about the good life all you want. You still didn't have a car to drive in 1939. Put all this together and add in the larger question of consumer goods, which, as I talked about in the last episode, there are some consumer goods like Coca-Cola, like going to the movies, that become more widely available. But because of Nazi rearmament goals and production policies, you're not seeing this explosion of consumer goods that you'll see after World War II that really do actually make a lot of people quite happy, at least the generation that grows up in the 50s. So how important, how effective is all this stuff in the long run if we point out these kind of criticisms? Let me start by saying that I think these are all very legitimate arguments to make. And yet, I think regardless of the material shortcomings, regardless of the ways in which the Nazi rhetoric perhaps did not match up to reality, one can also agree that these programs carried out an important psychological function, or that they had a certain political value because of their psychological function. In a period of widespread cynicism and frustration, they provided a comforting and forward-looking ideology for those who were defined by the Nazis as Aryans and who did not openly oppose the regime. Ideas like beauty of labor and strength through joy signaled to ordinary Germans that the Nazi Party cared about them, that unlike the previous regimes, it was actually trying to do something to help them. To put this another way, the Nazis were not simply trying to alleviate the suffering caused by the Great Depression. Instead, they were seen as fundamentally trying to improve ordinary people's lives through dynamic and direct actions. That they could sell this program as one that would overcome long-standing social divisions in German society made it even more desirable. The German-American historian Peter Gay has written about the hunger for wholeness in 1920s German society, which is basically the idea that as ordinary people are sort of battered by modernity and urbanization and change, what Germans in this period really want is something simple, something whole, something unifying and comforting. And so in essence, I'd argue that regardless of their material impact, the Nazi social welfare programs we've talked about today can be understood as an attempt to satisfy those desires. The idea of unity, the idea that the party was making the good life available to all the members of the nation, these were, I would argue, incredibly powerful ideas that helped form the foundations of the Nazi dictatorship. They were perhaps equally important as the creation of the more notorious camps, the paramilitary organizations, the other levels of repression going on in Nazi German society. Again, to reiterate something I said at the beginning of the podcast, when you put yourself in the shoes of many of these ordinary Germans living through the Third Reich, and you ask, what do you associate with it? What do you remember about it before 1939? Many of them would have said, I remember empowerment. I remember unity. I remember wholeness. I remember this as a moment of more freedom than less. Which sounds crazy to us so long as we understand freedom in a political and legal sense, and not in a social and experiential one, which is what most people experience on a daily basis. But we'll get into this more as we go through the podcast. For now, let me thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed the episode, please give us a rating on Apple or Spotify, or give us a shout out on social media. If you follow the podcast for a while, you know I'm not really good at social media, even though it is, of course, today one of the best ways to reach a podcasting audience. I don't really have a lot of time for it, and I don't enjoy it naturally. So if you have mentioned the show on social media, many thanks. We really appreciate it. Finally, in our next episode, we'll discuss the last element that helped underwrite Hitler's dictatorship before 1939. This was the idea of returning to national glory. As we've seen in our own times today, right? The idea of returning to national glory is a powerful political force that can mobilize support really in many different cultures and contexts. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk a little bit about German rearmament. We'll talk about the run-up to the outbreak of war in September 1939. And then in the episode after that, we'll get into a little bit Nazi racial politics and the idea of racializing society. So I think you'll find these next two episodes to be very interesting, and I hope you join us as we take history off the page.